Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. We're live. It's 1 p.m. Eastern Time on Wednesday, June 29th, 2022. And today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators over the last 7 days. This past week has been an interesting one in our profession. We've seen some unique topics come to the surface, some old questions on challenging issues in the past, and some real important data related to student desires and student needs that we need to be aware of in international admissions and recruitment. So we're going to tackle these three questions as we do each week. For those that are new to the Roundup, we take our news stories from our newsletter that comes out Mondays at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. I'm dropping the links to our SMIE Consulting website, smieconsulting.org/subscribe, dropping those links in the chat on Facebook and YouTube. I'll be adding those to our live stream chats on LinkedIn and Twitter a little bit later this afternoon. But wanted to give you an opportunity. If you aren't subscribed already, you can also, if you don't want to do it through the website, you can also do that if you're more of a LinkedIn user. We have our newsletter that's distributed through LinkedIn as well, dropping the link to that most recent edition as well into the chat. So it's really been an interesting week, and as we do each week, we take the news, the themes that we cover or the questions that we cover here on the Roundup from our newsletter that comes out Monday mornings. So as you get that on Monday mornings, if you like to play games and figure out what's Marty going to talk about this week on the Roundup, you'll be able to see all of those news stories and perhaps see where there might be critical masses of content that will allow us to go a little bit more in depth here on Wednesday afternoons. So we're going to be talking today about three questions that have been popping into mind quite a bit over the last few days. First up is international student recruitment marketing broken? And this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. As you may know, I've been in international education my entire professional career, going on 30 years next year. And one of the things that I've always found remarkable in terms of how institutions have or have not done international student recruitment is institutionally, oftentimes there is very little bandwidth, very little commitment, very little resources dedicated specifically to true marketing activities, to establish brand awareness in market, to maintain a presence digitally, to really connect on an ongoing basis with prospective students and their parents via online means. And the article that we're referring to, where we take a lot of what we're talking about today, is from a colleague that I met back in December at the AIRC conference. His name is Mauricio Segura, and he has a company he started a couple of years ago called Platty, P-L-A-T-T-Y. He's based in Australia, originally from Brazil, really a Aussie, Kiwi, Brazilian mix, and he has established Platty. And Platty, if you're not familiar, is kind of short for platypus, and platypus is the only mammal that lays eggs in the world. So that's kind of a unique animal in and of itself. And his company, Platty, he's using this article, and it's a Pie News article, kind of talking about his take on international marketing. And I tend to agree with a lot of what Mauricio has to say. But the basic concepts of what we're talking about here, and I'll put the link to that article in the chat as well. You have that now for your connection. If you're live on Facebook and YouTube, you'll get that link as we're going through. We are talking today about this topic of international higher ed marketing because it is often an afterthought at most institutions. There are a few well-funded institutions that have international as a real priority that will dedicate funds to international student recruitment, and that's not necessarily the same as international marketing. That there tend to be separate items. Very rarely are they combined into one office. One office may have responsibility for doing social media to support all institutional programs and departments and needs through the web or IT team. but very rarely will you see substantial dollars, or even some unsubstantial dollars, depending on your perspective, maybe $40,000, $50,000 devoted to international student marketing. Not going to recruitment fairs, not signing up with prospective lead gen sources, that type of thing. Something that is really designed to capitalize on online and digital tools to drive interest in an institution beyond profiles. That is really leveraging social media, leveraging online presence to really drive traffic, to drive interest, and to convert traffic into applicants and eventual students. So when you talk to your web team, your marketing office on campus, and you find out what their budget is, you ask them the question, well, you guys do ads, you do commercials, you do digital banners, you have all this budget that you commit to promoting the institution. And they go, of course, yeah. And then you ask, well, how much of that are you devoting to student recruitment, ads, that type of thing? And they'll say, here's X dollars out of our budget, X dollars out of Y budget is devoted to domestic student recruitment efforts, commercials, banner ads, all those kinds of things, social media efforts. So when you ask, okay, what percentage of that, of your budget is for international? And you'll usually get a lot of blank stares and a hemming and hawing and say, well, none. And very rarely, if you do, if they have any budget, it's like if they got some leftover money, they might throw a bone to the International Recruitment Office or International Student Admissions Office, and then they have some funds, but really no direction. And I say that and I agree with Mauricio in terms of marketing is broken in international higher ed. We don't really know what we're doing. We have ideas of what we want to do, but we don't have 2 or 3 things necessary to make it happen. Internal bandwidth within our offices to leverage social media, to leverage digital ads, to leverage an online presence and establish an online presence in markets where you don't already have these things. Those are things that typically are the biggest roadblocks and really prevent any office from making any significant progress in direct international higher ed marketing to students and parents. There are those that realize that may have money, but then realize they don't have the bandwidth themselves to do it, but they want to farm it out. There are companies out there that do these kinds of things, but they often tend to be cookie cutter kind of approaches that, oh yeah, we can do X, Y, Z for you because we have run campaigns in certain markets for institutions, but it's usually a cookie cutter approach. There are some, and we've talked about folks like Inted out there in the marketplace that are really customized and do specific campaigns in specific markets with specific goals to drive applications, to drive conversion, that type of thing. So there are people out there doing it. So not all international student recruitment marketing efforts are, in the US particularly, are bad, but they are very rarely done in-house. Very rarely. Those that try might have $10,000 to do a variety of international marketing related efforts, where if it's beyond anything like a student profile or a college profile on different search sites, usually it might be, we got to do a video, we've got to do maybe translations of our content, we've got to have a locally hosted site in certain markets. There are services out there like that that can provide that, but to develop those resources in-house is very difficult and time-consuming, and most international student recruitment offices are siloed on campus and don't necessarily have those resources or staff time or bandwidth or even knowledge of how to do that using social, using digital in other markets. And there are differences, and those are things that, frankly, an international student recruiter is not going to be aware of all those differences in all their major markets. They may learn that over time after consultation, a lot of trial and error. If they try to do it themselves, they may figure that out. But the actual greater majority of folks that are doing it are kind of doing it on a shoestring. They may have established an account. Say for China, they may have established a WeChat account, but is it a verified account? Is it do you have locally hosted website content in that market that you can regularly update and change? There are services that do that, but very few are taking advantage of these things. And that's one of the things that I point to in Mauricio's article that is particularly relevant, and that is when the things that he says are the missing pieces in a lot of institutions' strategies, where social media is all but an afterthought, and if any institution is doing international student-focused social media, tends to be very, oh, let's do it on Facebook, let's do it on YouTube, and that might be it. Maybe some Instagram, but we're seeing very few institutions really have the bandwidth and knowledge and expertise to know in country that YouTube's not going to be the most direct way to reach students in this market. We need to be on Insta or in Facebook. Yeah, in certain countries, Facebook still is important, but in most, it may not be as much anymore. So it's that knowledge, and it's the kind of approach towards those platforms in certain markets. It's using in-country language, that native language in certain markets, that is going to be particularly important and allows you to target your markets much more effectively. That having not necessarily boots on the ground to do the travel, the agent work with students individually, that's all is an important component, but how are you doing it digitally? And that's really what we're talking about here in terms of the missing pieces. Very few will use that in-country digital knowledge to understand how do we handle websites in this country, how do we handle social in this country. So that, frankly, the knowledge base, the bandwidth isn't typically going to be housed in one office in a university or college campus. So that's the piece that Mauricio is really referring to, that in terms of knowing that the system is broken, because that kind of expertise doesn't exist, and precious few institutions have to dedicate resources to either get that expertise or figure it out themselves over time or farm it out. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about Mauricio's approach, is that he does take it with Platy, does take it and focuses it in particular markets to help drive particular metrics in your key destination or source markets for your institution. So there's a lot to do digitally to improve how we do international student recruitment, and oftentimes it's far down on the priority list, just because you got to deal with your in-country representatives, you got to have your presence on the major search sites, but really there's a third layer that in terms of having the presence and globally, and having in-country reps and having that digital middle ground. Where you can really drive home your points for your institution. And that's really the piece that's missing. An associated article to that was one that's gotten a little bit of a critique in certain markets from certain folks out in the wider world of international ed consulting and commentating. And it was an ISF Monitor article that talks about visually led, the growing power of image-first design in international student marketing. And this one is reflects something that we all know is the case. The data might be less important than the actual content, which I think the message of that content is that the visual media is how we need to be approaching Gen Z, our current recruitment generation that we're trying to bring to our colleges. And what a good website looks like in this day and age. So there's some of those kind of very basic points that they're making, but it is content that is can be missed by a lot of institutions. And particularly when you drill down to your international content on your sites, what's the appeal of it? Does it have a visual first, image first approach? An image can be obviously photos, but also video content, short form video content that is just on a loop. Is that part of your international homepage per se? Are you doing anything to provide a very minimalist version of the above the fold kind of content to really drive that, capture the eye and drive the attention, keeping in mind the shortening attention spans, whether it's 8 seconds or not. The point is students need to feel like they are they're going to digest their information quickly, make a decision whether to pursue it further or move on. So it's a good article. I'll just put it in there as kind of backup for what we're talking about here. But hopefully this gives you a good sense of what we're really after in terms of this point on is international higher ed marketing broken? And for most institutions it is, because frankly we don't have the bandwidth to really do all that we need to do to be truly effective. So we're kind of oftentimes feeling around in the dark trying to figure out what works, or trial and error type of approaches. There's a little bit of that involved in what you need to do on international marketing, but it's not solely the focus, shouldn't solely be the focus of just more of an afterthought. It needs to be one of the central elements in terms of what you do. Not only having a digital presence of your own, not only having the on-the-ground agents or networks that you're using, but also maintaining that level of contact digitally and in a focused and targeted way with language and local in-country content in your key markets. So that's the point of that one. So yes, it is broken, but not everywhere. But there is help to be found if you have budget and are willing to put in the necessary legwork and be willing to let go a little bit. And that's an important part of that process, I think, realizing that we can't do it all on our own. So that's question number one. Let's move on to question two. Are student visa overstays a real problem? This is a topic that hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention recently, but certainly is one that if you're in international education, you certainly recognize how significant this was during the last administration. It was an area that was placing student visa holders squarely in the sights of the previous administration, and doing previous administration and certain individuals within the previous administration that were clearly anti-immigrant and clearly doing everything they could to reduce the number of qualified students that could come into this country, as well as other immigrant categories. And that is visa overstays. There were arguments made by the previous administration that it's such a significant problem that it's running rampant. There's just students are coming and they're overstaying visas and their current status isn't known, or not. They could be doing anything in this country. They're terrorist cells, or whatever the case might have been. Whatever the fear-mongering approach of that previous administration related to anything that wasn't natural born was put everybody in the crosshairs, to be honest, and students were in the mix for non-immigrant visas holders, and that is something that they used as a weapon to kind of stir it up. Well, we got to do something about this. That's why we had to. But there was a proposal to end DS in the previous administration, duration of status, that would have currently allows students to stay in the country as long as they're maintaining status, which to whatever degree or program they're in, that as long as they're maintaining satisfactory progress towards that full time, all of the necessary components of being an international student, they were okay. The potential to eliminate that and force students to renew their visas every year, every 2 years, whatever it might be, was potentially a huge administrative hurdle that would have bogged down ICE and DHS even more than it already is. So CBP as well. So we look at what's happening since the change in administration, and we certainly see that based on a report that was released on the previous fiscal year, dropped a link to that report from DHS into the chat, and it goes into the actual data of what the visa overstay rates were. And you look at it, the overall at the end of FY 2020, there was the visa overstay rate was 1.27% of all the hundreds of thousands of immigrants, non-immigrant visas, categories. Less than 1.3% were in overstay categories. So very insignificant in the big scope of things. When we drill down to specifically students, we see that for student visas, it was about 1.55 of the, according to this number, 1,800,000 student and exchange visitors scheduled to complete their program in the United States. Now, one of the things that's important here even why the student rate, and it's not significantly higher, 1.55 versus 1.27. You look at it and you think about what that means. Student visa categories, FM and Js, other than the Js that have 2-year home residency requirements that they have to go home, so that's a very identifiable number. Very few of them are in this overstay category. You have F and Ms, mostly Fs, where if they transition to another status, where they may have applied for, they've been on OPT, and then they get their company that they're working for applies for an H-1B for them, or they transition into another visa status, they can potentially be counted in that overstay if there's no way to document where they are. So there's some data in here that's important to keep in mind in terms of how we evaluate these numbers. And I really think that what we see in terms of our visa overstay rates in the U.S. not been a significant issue when it comes to students, particularly post-SEVIS, where the tracking is there and students can be accounted for much more easily through the digital systems that are in place. So I think the visa overstay problem has long been overstated, particularly by the previous administration, and the data simply doesn't support that claim anymore. That they often made that claim without backing it up with any real data. So it's something that I think we look at and we see the actual numbers, and we realize this is not a big deal in the grand scheme of things in terms of numbers that we're referencing here. So I think what we're seeing is becoming less of an issue, and one that is not going to, certainly in this current administration, isn't going to get the kind of media attention that it certainly did in the previous administration. So the visa overstay rate, let's put that one to bed and say non-issue as far as bigger scope of all the problems in our immigration system. That is way down on the priority list in terms of why things that need immediate action. So let's move on to our third and final question of the day. And this is always ultimately what anyone who's in international student recruitment will say you need to know. And that is, what do students want? Not only do you, as part of your responsibilities in international recruitment, international admissions, international education in general, is knowing what your audience wants, knowing where they are, where they spend their time, and being able to listen for what those cues are to help you better target their needs. Now, one market that we talk about regularly here on the Roundup, because it's the second leading source market for the United States. In some countries like Canada, it is the #1 market, and that is India. And we're talking today about what do Indian students going abroad want? And that is an answer that everybody wants to know who's in student recruitment. And it's one that if you spend any time in the field, talking to international students or talking specifically to Indian students, you get. And it is, they are looking for information about work opportunities after they're done with their degrees. Now, post-study work has been, over the last 3 or 4 years, has regularly been at or near the top of every student survey, prospective student survey, who are looking to go abroad in terms of what they want out of their destination market. There'll be some in some countries where, depending on where they're from, that maybe reputation of an institution might be more important, or value for money would be more important, lower cost or whatever it might be. Prestige gets up there, rankings obviously factor in. So quality measures and career opportunities, post-study work, have generally been 1 or 2 in almost all student surveys of the last decade. But what we've seen recently is the rise of the importance of outcomes. And colleagues of mine on international education globally have talked regularly about the importance of institutions being able to talk to specifically international audiences about the value of what a degree will get them as an incoming student. And we talk about outcomes. The surveys now over the last 2 or 3 years, the percentage of students that are hyper-focused on this is on the idea of what am I going to get for my degree? Particularly if you're coming for a master's or doctoral program where it's not necessarily a terminal degree, but one where you're, particularly if you're paying your own way, you want to know what the value is going to be for your education. Certainly parents of undergraduate students that are coming in want to know what they're dropping upwards of $250,000 or more is for their son or daughter. What are they going to get out of this? Is it just a cocktail party conversation thing for knowing they have a degree from a U.S. institution? Or is it really, I need to know what kind of jobs I'm going to get, what kind of access to graduate education I'm going to get in that country as a result of going to your institution? That's the kind of thing that is driving most students around the world these days, knowing what the outcomes are. Now, it's one thing to know that your prospective student audiences are wanting that information or wanting to know what the chances are of getting a job after graduation. But it's another thing entirely for your institution to have that data, to have those anecdotal stories that can share specifically with those students that are coming from abroad what their chances are of qualifying for work or potential jobs after graduation. Now, I say that because career services offices generally have information on, well, 80% of our graduates have a job. Undergraduate students who are not going on to further graduate study will have a job within 6 months of graduation. Obviously, that's great to have that kind of a stat, and yeah, if that's all you got, you certainly need to have that in your locker when you're talking to prospective students. But very rarely do institutions have that kind of a data point or other data points for international students. And that's just, it's probably one area of international higher education that is least covered or least emphasized by campuses is, okay, yeah, all we're doing is getting our international students a degree. We don't really have information for them. Yes, they can come to our job fairs. Yes, they can have access to our services, but we're not doing anything specific for them to help them get a job in the United States. And we're probably doing even less to try and help them, if that's possible, even less to help them find jobs overseas, potentially back home. That's the piece that you really want to laser focus in on if you're getting nothing else from this conversation today. What do Indian students want when if they're going abroad to study? The digital journal survey that you're gonna see the results, and actually it's from Into, one of the major pathway providers in the United States. Almost 8 in 10 Indian Gen Z students, 76%, looking to study abroad, plan to work and settle overseas after completing their international degree. And that was a total of over 1,000 Indian students participated in the survey commissioned by Into to track the changing aspirations of Gen Z post-pandemic. So this is a significant piece that U.S. institutions in particular need to pay attention to. Why? Because these students are hyper-focused in India on that post-study work. It may not be as significant in other countries, and there will be differences, and that's going to be clear. Anyone who talks to students from other markets, they might have already family business back home that they're going to be going home to take over. They're coming to the U.S. to get trained so that they can do that job when they get back home. There are others that are going on for further graduate study. There are others that don't have a job waiting for them when they get back, or not on a scholarship that has a job attached to it, that they are now hoping to, if not stay in the United States, they're going to be those that want to stay in the U.S. who aren't going on for further studies, and they're going to be those that want to go home. Those two groups you have to be able to provide at least basic level information to both if you're truly going to be ticking that box on how well are you doing to help international students prepare for the steps after graduation. In terms of knowing that there are employers that come to campus who will hire international students. Do you even know that information and be able to track that information? Are you tracking where they get their OPT when they've gone and they're working with the international office to file their OPT paperwork and get their new I-20 for that? Do you have that reliable data that you can refer to? If not, start taking the time, have a task of GA with collecting that data from your CVIS folks on campus. If not, work with Career Services to develop models that will help you track that better moving forward. You gotta start doing that if you want to be responsive to the needs of prospective students that are going to be asking you the questions of what am I going to get for my degree? Yes, I'll get a degree, but what is that degree going to entitle me to or give me access to? Either in the United States or back home. You need to have some solid answers and hopefully data to eventually back that up. Anecdotal stories will go so far and will do well to help you provide that the successful examples of what your programs can deliver for prospective students. But if you don't have those stories yet, you start gathering that data. Ideally, you want both. Because not everybody is a data person. People want to hear from somebody who's been a success, and you need both of those in your arsenal eventually. So work towards that. But because for the Indian market, they're going to be hyper focused on it. They're going to ask you these questions if you meet them in fairs in country in India, or if you're dealing with questions over email or at virtual events. You're going to get these questions. Certainly, when they get to campus, they're going to ask you about jobs, either CPT opportunities or eventually OPT. So know that it's coming, and then start preparing for that. One way you can get ahead of the curve a little bit is to have the data that can help you justify why Career Services needs to be investing in this as a topic of development for their offices and potentially funded some of the projects that they're going to need to do to get that kind of data or provide the kinds of opportunities they need to for your future graduates from overseas. One of those is an upcoming webinar I'm going to plug for July 7th. So that's going to be a week from tomorrow, Thursday. So Thursday, July 7th. It's sponsored by iGraduate. It's a free webinar you can sign up for. I'm dropping a link to in the chat for it now. It's also in our newsletter on Monday. And this is specifically for the U.S. and Canadian markets. It provides you content and data points for currently enrolled international students talking about what they're finding, where their level of satisfaction is with their experiences on campus, where the lowest level of satisfactions are, where the highest level of satisfaction is related to academics, related to campus and class sizes and experience in the classroom, experience with professors, the study environment, all of that. But also Career Services is one of those things that you get a chance to look at. And you'll find from their initial slides, you see in terms of one of the lowest areas rated in terms of satisfaction with higher education institutions in the U.S. and Canada is with Career Services and career advice. So there'll be more data on that. I certainly encourage you all to register for this webinar if you're not already. It can be a real eye-opener, I'm sure, and help you gather the data you need to be able to share with administrators on campus as to why this needs to be a focus of not just your office's work as an international office, but the campus as a whole, and specifically Career Services. So that's all we have for you today on the Midweek Roundup. We appreciate you joining with us and being a part of the conversation. We'll certainly be looking forward to future conversations about these topics and more in the Midweek Roundups to come. And keep in mind, by the end of this summer, we're going to be hitting our 200th episode of the Midweek Roundup. So we're hoping that you can join us for a special event when we hit that later this summer. So thanks again for being a part of the journey, and we look forward to chatting with you again soon. Cheers.